I grew up in rural Oklahoma, where thunderstorms aren't rare, they're part of life. Every spring and early summer, the sky turns a dull green-gray before a storm hits. I never feared it, not really, but I always paid attention. The stories people tell about lightning striking houses, barns, or trees aren't just exaggerations. I saw the proof firsthand one night, and I've never forgotten it. I was 28 and working as a lineman for a small electrical company in the county. My job required me to be outside, often during storms, checking power lines and transformers. I'd been trained extensively on storm safety, and we had protocols for when to stop work or take shelter. But that night, I learned that even following every rule doesn't guarantee safety. It started late in the afternoon. The radar had shown a severe thunderstorm building fast to the north of our service area. By 5:30 p.m., the sky had turned that familiar green-gray, and the air felt heavy, humid, and oppressive. The first rumble of thunder came in the distance while we were still on a routine check near the edge of town, inspecting a pole line that ran behind a cluster of farms. My crew of 3 stopped briefly to evaluate the weather. The radar indicated the storm was moving slowly, and we debated whether to finish our work or head back to the office. One of the newer guys, Mark, insisted we could finish the last few poles in about 20 minutes. I agreed, not because I wanted to risk it, but because the system looked manageable and the wind wasn't strong yet. By the time we reached the 5th pole, clouds were rolling in faster, and the rain began to spit at us slightly. We donned our rain gear, clipped our harnesses, and continued. Lightning had started, but it wasn't striking near enough to pose immediate danger. That's what made the moment so surreal. It felt routine, almost like any other storm. We were finishing our inspection when it happened. A single bolt of lightning struck a tree about 30 yards from us. Not close enough to hit the lines. Not even close to where we were standing. But I saw it hit. I saw the energy explode along the trunk, and the smell of ozone hit me instantly. Then the ground shook. Not just a vibration, but a deep, resonant thrum. My boots sank slightly into the wet soil, and for a fraction of a second, it felt like the storm had paused, like the world itself was holding its breath. Mark screamed, and I turned to see him bent over, his hair standing straight up. That's when I realized it wasn't just the tree that had been hit. The bolt had traveled along the underground moisture, moving unpredictably toward the ground where we stood. I yelled for everyone to drop to the ground. We hit the wet earth, covering our heads instinctively. The thrum continued, like electricity had pooled under the soil. Then it passed. When I stood, I noticed Mark was shaking uncontrollably, pale, and mumbling something about sparks traveling through his body. He had no burns, no visible injuries, but his eyes were wild, staring at the pole in front of him. I called the office and told them what had happened. They sent an ambulance, even though we argued there were no injuries. Mark insisted on being checked. By the time the EMTs arrived, he had calmed down slightly, but he couldn't speak clearly. All he did was trace patterns in the mud with his finger, muttering numbers and sequences that made no sense. The storm didn't stop. It hung over the area for hours. Lines went down elsewhere in the county. Power outages were reported across 3 towns, and I spent the night assisting other crews. But I kept thinking about that lightning strike, about how close we had been, about how normal it had seemed until it wasn't. Mark was eventually diagnosed with a mild form of electric shock, though his vitals were normal. He returned to work, but never fully recovered mentally. He often stares at the ground when it rains, tracing patterns with his finger again. I learned that night that storms don't just endanger you in obvious ways. They can leave marks that aren't visible, marks on your perception, your memory, and your understanding of how fragile ordinary life can be. I never look at a storm the same way. I never take proximity or experience as protection. Even years later, when the sky turns that green-gray before a storm, I check the trees around my house. I measure the distance from poles, from wires, from trees. And I wonder if I'll ever feel truly safe when the first crack of lightning rumbles overhead. I've lived in northern Louisiana my whole life, close enough to the Mississippi to feel the effects of heavy rains and seasonal flooding. For years, I'd driven backroads during storms, trying to avoid traffic or the highways that flooded first. Most of the time, you'd get wet, maybe scrape your truck on a slick shoulder, but it wasn't dangerous. That night changed how I think about water, storms, and being alone on roads that feel familiar. It started in early May. The forecast was nothing out of the ordinary. Scattered thunderstorms, isolated flooding, a chance of tornadoes, but nothing severe on paper. I was finishing up a late shift at a warehouse near Monroe and headed home around 7:30 p.m. My route took me along a series of small county roads that cut through farmland and forest. These roads are narrow, often shaded by trees on either side, and they twist in ways you don't notice until you need to react fast. By the time I was halfway home, the storm hit. Heavy rain, not wind at first, just sheets of water falling so fast that visibility dropped to a few hundred feet. The truck handled fine, but the rearview mirror showed water pooling rapidly along the shoulders. I slowed down and drove cautiously, checking the small creeks along the route. Some were rising faster than usual. Around 8:15, I reached a section I knew well. A narrow wooden bridge crosses a small creek that usually only floods during weeks of heavy rain. Tonight, the water was high, lapping at the underside of the bridge. The current looked stronger than I expected. I stopped and looked. There was no sign of anyone else on the road. No cars, no headlights in the distance. Just water and rain. I debated turning around, but the detour would add 30 minutes, and the storm didn't feel severe yet. I drove across slowly. Halfway through, the bridge trembled under the weight of the water. Not violently, but enough that I felt the metal grating beneath the tires vibrate. My stomach tightened. I got to the other side and parked at a small pull-off, just to breathe and check the map. That's when I noticed something in the trees along the creek. Movement, not wind-blown branches. Something higher, shaped vaguely like a person, standing perfectly still. For a moment, I thought it was a hunter or someone waiting out the rain. I called out softly. Nothing. I grabbed my phone to shine the flashlight. Still nothing. Then it was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the rain and trees. A shadow. I restarted the truck and continued along the back road. The rain had intensified now, slanting sideways as wind picked up. I passed the old Abner farmhouse, long abandoned, boarded windows, moss-covered roof. The road curved sharply past it, and I noticed water starting to cross the surface. The first inch, nothing dangerous. Then 2-3 inches, spreading fast. I slowed further. That's when the truck started to float slightly. I could feel it, tires still turning, but the water carried the truck sideways a bit. I tried to steer, but it was slipping. My heart raced, but I stayed calm. I knew better than to panic. I tried to back up, but the road behind was already covered in water. I was stuck. I put the truck in park and tried to call for help. No signal. That was unusual. This stretch usually has spotty coverage, but I'd get a single bar at least. Nothing. Then I saw it again. Along the embankment, partially hidden in the trees. A figure, dark, standing motionless. No reflection, no eyes visible. Just an outline. The storm made everything hazy, but it didn't move. Didn't change posture, didn't react to me. I tried to reason. Maybe someone else had been stranded, walking for help. Maybe it was a person in dark clothing, but the more I looked, the more wrong it felt. The figure was exactly where I'd seen it when I stopped at the bridge. How could it have moved so precisely? And yet it hadn't. The water rose faster. By 8:50, the truck was barely stable. I could see mud starting to float into the wheels. I considered leaving it and walking, but the surrounding area was forest and swamp. There were no roads in sight, no lights. I'd get lost instantly. I stayed in the truck. I turned the engine off, kept the lights low, and tried to wait out the water. Rain hammered the windshield. Branches snapped somewhere close. Every once in a while, I caught glimpses of the figure. Always still, always at the edge of visibility, always exactly the distance it had to be to make me notice it without fully seeing it. Hours passed. I kept glancing at the clock. Time felt distorted. The storm didn't let up. By midnight, the creek had risen significantly, almost to the top of the embankment. I saw large debris floating past. I considered calling 911 again, but there was no signal, and the storm had isolated the road completely. At some point, exhaustion set in. I rested my head on the steering wheel for a few minutes, thinking I'd been trapped forever. When I woke, dawn had barely begun to break. The rain slowed to a drizzle. I saw the figure one last time, standing just at the edge of the water, perfectly still. Then it vanished. I carefully backed the truck to higher ground. Water receded enough for me to continue. When I reached a main road, I finally had signal. Nothing on the news about missing people. Nothing on the radar showing such a stationary storm. Nothing on social media. But the road I'd been on was officially closed for flooding. I told a friend about it later. He laughed at first, but then he mentioned locals reporting seeing someone, or something, standing in the trees during floods, always in the same spots, never moving. Old stories about people disappearing on back roads during storms. I had always thought those were exaggerated. Now I wasn't so sure. Years later, I still avoid that stretch of road when storms hit. I know exactly where the water rises, where the trees cast shadows, and where the figure seems to stand. I don't drive back roads in storms anymore. I don't take chances. That night taught me that storms aren't just dangerous because of water or wind. They're dangerous because of the things you don't see until it's too late. I grew up in eastern Kentucky, not far from the Daniel Boone National Forest. I know the hills, the hollows, and the ridges like the back of my hand. I spent a lot of time camping and hiking as a teenager. Then later, as a ranger's assistant, I learned to read the woods, the weather, and how to predict dangerous conditions. I never liked storms at night in the forest, not because they were loud or spectacular, but because storms make the familiar strange. This story begins in late June, the kind of early summer where storms can roll in suddenly and stick around for hours. I was 29 and had agreed to spend the weekend in a remote cabin with a friend, Matt, just to get out of town. The cabin was on a ridge, accessible only by a dirt road that winds up from the nearest highway. It was old but maintained enough for weekend use. Electricity, running water, and a small propane heater. The nearest neighbor was almost a mile down the road. The day started clear. We drove up late afternoon, carried our gear inside, set up food and a small propane stove. By 5:30 p.m., clouds started rolling in. I didn't pay much attention at first. In the mountains, clouds move fast, and a ridge can trap moisture. By 6 p.m., the sky had turned dark slate gray, and the wind picked up. Matt joked about needing a storm beer and went to check the propane line. I stayed inside. Around 6:45, rain started. Not a drizzle, but a steady, horizontal downpour that drummed against the metal roof. The wind made the cabin rock slightly. I went to the window and watched the trees sway. The creek below the ridge had already started rising, and I could see debris floating past. By 7:15, the storm had intensified. Thunder rolled constantly, and I could hear the rain bouncing off the dirt road outside. Matt suggested we go sit near the fireplace. I agreed, though I stayed near the windows to monitor the weather. That's when I noticed it. Movement on the ridge across from the cabin. A flash of white. At first, I thought it was a deer. Then it disappeared. I told myself it was just a trick of the storm, shadows from lightning. But the feeling stayed, a sense that someone or something was watching. Around 8 p.m., the lights flickered. The cabin had a small backup generator, but it wouldn't start automatically in this model. I grabbed a flashlight and checked the breaker box. Everything seemed fine. The lights came back, but I kept glancing at the ridge. That sense of observation didn't fade. Around 8:45, a knock sounded on the door. Heavy, deliberate. I froze. The road is too muddy to have anyone arrive unnoticed. I whispered to Matt. He said it was probably someone lost from the highway. But no car lights, no sound of a vehicle. I told him I'd check outside, flashlight in hand. When I opened the door, no one was there. The ridge was just trees and mist from the rain. Footprints, nothing. Muddy ground, dry in front of the door. I stepped back inside. Matt shrugged, thinking I'd imagined it. The storm continued all night. The creek below the cabin rose higher, and water began seeping near the foundation. Around midnight, the wind shifted and brought in a strange smell, wet soil, but also something like burnt wood and decay. I couldn't place it. Around 12:30 a.m., I went to the bedroom to check on Matt. He was awake, staring at the window facing the ridge. I followed his gaze. The figure was back, a pale outline, standing perfectly still at the edge of the tree line. No movement, no reflection, nothing resembling clothing, just a shape. I grabbed my binoculars. The figure didn't move. I counted for 10 minutes. Nothing changed. I whispered Matt's name. The figure didn't react. Around 1 a.m., the wind increased. Trees creaked. The cabin rocked more. The creek below the ridge started flooding a nearby footpath. I realized that even if we left now, the road might be impassable. At 1:30 a.m., a flash of lightning revealed another figure. This one closer, behind a tree, partially hidden. Two figures, or the same one moving? I couldn't tell. Every time I looked away, it seemed the figure got closer. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was lost hikers, maybe campers, maybe forest rangers checking on us. None of it made sense. The ridge was too steep, the storm too severe, the distance too far for anyone to appear silently, standing for hours in that rain. At 2:15 a.m., I heard a subtle movement inside the cabin. Not footsteps, not anything normal. A shift, like the air changed. Matt was asleep. I wasn't. I got my phone, tried to call 911. No signal. I tried texting friends. Nothing. By 2:45, the creek had reached the base of the cabin. Water seeped through the foundation. I moved mattresses and furniture as a barrier. The figure was still visible from the window. Not advancing, not retreating, just observing. Around 3:30, the storm began to lessen. Rain slowed. The wind dropped, but the figure didn't leave. Even as daylight approached around 4:30, the shape stayed. I tried to get a photo through the rain-streaked window. The image came out as a pale blur, indistinct. We left the cabin around 6 a.m., carefully navigating the dirt road. No footprints on the ridge. No signs of anyone else. Just the damage from the storm, fallen branches, mud, and debris. We never returned. Later, a local ranger told me stories about the ridge, about watchers during storms, about people who vanished near the ridge in severe weather. I had always laughed at folklore. Now I didn't. I keep thinking about that night, about how long the figure stayed, about how storms can make the familiar unfamiliar, about how alone you are when the world outside gets too loud and the shapes in the dark feel like they are keeping time with the storm. I haven't stayed overnight in a remote cabin during a storm since,